We all seek love and affection, often in the form of a relationship. Now, a partner should help you feel happy, comfortable, and confident. But sadly, should we stumble across the wrong person, they can make us feel quite the opposite. Sophie Elliot was unfortunate enough to experience this, and tragically, her kind-hearted nature would lead her into the hands of a narcissistic, violent monster. When Sophie accepted the love of a tutor around 10 years older, she accepted maturity and stability, but sadly, she would find quite the opposite. Welcome back to the ASMR True Crime channel. If you are new and like this kind of content, please consider subscribing to help me out. Today's story is chilling. It involves an unhealthy relationship, narcissism, and a very obsessive monster. So with all of that said, let's get to it. Today we take the long journey down to the beautiful and often underappreciated country of New Zealand. To those Americans out there, it is often referred to as Australia's Canada, sporting spectacular scenery and a more rural lifestyle. Our case takes place in the South Island named Te Waipunamu. Focusing even further, we found ourselves in the city of Dunedin, serving as the second largest city on the southern island after Christchurch. Dunedin is a coastal city with a very outdoorsy lifestyle, seen by many as an attractive place to settle and raise a family, if you can afford it. Here we found the Elliot family, made up of mother and father, Leslie and Gil, and their 3 children, Chris, Nick, and 22-year-old Sophie, still living with her parents. Sophie studied economics at the University of Otago. She was very close to the both of them, with her mother in particular. So much so she felt comfortable confiding in her about almost anything. Now, Sophie was a very confident child. She loved to dress up in her mother's clothes, and at the age of 4 she was enrolled in ballet class, which she adored. Her deep love for performance continued into her teenage years when she became interested in drama and music alongside her passion for dance. For Sophie's parents, seeing her perform and excel in her passions made them immensely proud. She was their budding angel, full of charisma and positivity. Sophie was academically gifted too, attending St. Hilda's College. She graduated with the Proxim Exit Cup, an award given to the second highest achieving student of the year. This basically meant that Sophie could go on to attend any university she desired, and in the end, she settled on the University of Otago to study economics, which unfortunately is where a fateful encounter integral to her story takes place. Despite excelling in the first 3 years of her bachelor's degree, Sophie realized during her master's year that she was going to need a little more academic support for her course. The subject material she was studying had become very complex, and after some disappointing results in her mock exams, she signed up for a few extra group classes taught by a senior tutor. And this is where she met the 33-year-old Clayton Witherston. This fateful encounter happened on a cold winter's evening, soon after tutoring began, when Clayton made the bold move to ask her if she would like to go out for dinner. The day was getting rather long in the tooth, and perhaps the two could cover some more course content over the meal. Quite flattered to receive the attention of a senior student and also simultaneously eager to get to know others in their field, she accepted his offer. But outside of studying their subject matter, Sophie didn't really was. Like Sophie, Clayton was born and raised in the South Island of New Zealand, but the environment that he grew up in was very different from her own. He wasn't confident, bubbly, or successful person by nature. Clayton's parents, whom I'll keep anonymous, described him as an anxious child who found any prospect of change extremely stressful. As a result, he rarely ventured outside of his comfort zone. Right up until his teenage years, he had a persistent problem with wetting the bed. Clayton also had issues with his eyesight, but refused to wear glasses as he thought they made him look foolish. Those around him, including his friends, described him as a very weird guy, and many of his peers felt uncomfortable around him, especially pertinent with women. During his teenage years, Clayton developed a very strange and strong obsession with being perfect at almost everything he attempted, most notably with his grades at schoolwork. Now, this was beyond the typical scope of perfectionism that a lot of us can experience. Everything he did had to be absolutely flawless, to the point that if he couldn't do it, he would be incredibly upset at himself. All things considered, this unhealthy behavioral pattern followed him all the way through high school, where the fixation would ultimately land him graduating at the very top of his class. But ironically, in a fashion very similar to Sophie's experience, his academic prowess began to falter once he hit university. Whenever Clayton scored anything less than perfect, he would ditch the entire class for the year and demand to reset in the following one. Seriously, this man was unhinged when it came to success. After taking several years to complete his course, he eventually progressed to a PhD in economics, which is when he met Sophie. At 22, Sophie was 9 years younger than Clayton. Many raised an eyebrow when the two started to date, and so began a strange and dark relationship. So, following their dinner after tutoring, a relationship began to blossom. But the honeymoon period was seemingly short-lived. The two had barely dated for 3 weeks before Sophie began to confide in her mom and complained that Clayton was periodically ignoring her. He took no notice of her for days on end, and despite making plans to meet with her, he would often fail to show up. This really wasn't what you'd call a promising start to a relationship, to say the least. But Sophie thought that maybe he was just very busy. Her mother disagreed, but without wanting to upset her daughter, she couldn't really say anything, and so instead, concern began to plague her mind. Luckily, Sophie's strange new relationship didn't hold her back from her own independence. In winter of 2007, she applied for a role at the Treasury in Wellington, which was a great move. After a convincing interview, she made a strong enough impression to secure the job, due to start in January of 2008. However, her last success made Clayton extremely jealous. In his former years, he too had applied for a job at the Treasury, but due to his strange demeanor and uncontrollable perfectionism, he was fired shortly after. With his girlfriend now achieving more than he had managed, despite being younger than him, the man's envy and resentment began to grow. The weak excuse of a boyfriend showed his true colors after this, and the situation turned volatile very quickly. Making unfortunately chose to continue seeing him. Despite several arguments mingled with intermittent temporary breakups, this sad sack of disappointment became more and more abusive. He criticized and picked on every apparent flaw that he could find in her, calling her fat and ugly, and even telling her that her eyes were too close together, which, by the way, from a superficial perspective, is extremely ironic because, seriously, have you seen what this guy looks like? Hardly an exemplary vision of attraction. In an effort to make her feel bad, Clayton would often compare Sophie to his previous partners, while later the same day he would also insist that she told him how good he was in bed. Whether this was his perfectionism speaking, or perhaps his own insecurity over his lack of performance in the bedroom, we will never quite know. But all of it is one aspect of the relationship that made no technical sense. Clayton constantly put Sophie down, but would also insist on positive encouragement from her toward him. He wanted to know that he was the best partner she had, while simultaneously making her feel as if she was nothing. After fishing for compliments from her one too many times, the rather disgruntled Sophie told him that, in fact, he was not that great in bed after all. And Clayton, he was absolutely furious to hear this. If he wasn't the best at everything, then he would never be happy. In November 2007, and following this revelation, the pair decided to break up, with only 2 months to go before Sophie started her new job in Wellington. Clayton had big news coming up too. After multiple years of self-imposed repeated exams, he was finally set to graduate. In an act of celebration, he threw a big party for his friends, and after extending the invite to Sophie, she gladly attended. Being a keen photographer, she also offered to photograph the night as a gesture of goodwill. She even created an endearing scrapbook for him, filling it with pictures and receipts of his graduation as a memento for the future, a true testament to her character. However, when Sophie showed up at his flat with her gift, the meeting took a turn for the worse. After arriving, he gestured for her to sit down on the sofa. It appears that Clayton thought Sophie's kindness meant that the relationship was now back on the cards. He asked her where their connection was going and what the scrapbook meant to her. After asking Sophie to come to the bedroom, she refused, and after rejecting him a second time, Clayton turned violent. Physically grabbing her, he attempted to pull her to the bedroom. Fortunately, Sophie managed to break free and escape to the car. But this was only after she'd been pinned down, screamed at, and insulted. Clayton charged after her, following her to the door of her car, and after pulling the car door open and screaming that he wished she would die, Sophie knew that she was done with him for good. In a world so fragile and cruel, there was no room for a partner or friend in her life that was so vicious and violent. And from the bottom of her heart, she knew that she was finally finished with this wretched man. Turning her keys in the ignition, Sophie made the drive back to her family, where she then sought comfort from her mother. The relationship and friendship were over. Clayton had had his final chance. January 9th, 2008. For the Elliot family, Christmas 2007 had come and gone without a hitch, and with the beginning of the new year came the beginning of a new era for Sophie as her job at the Treasury awaited. The date was January 9th, 2008. With some help from her mom, Sophie was busily packing for the life-changing move to Wellington. Leslie was greatly saddened to see her daughter leave, but she knew that this was one of the many rules of parenting, to cut the apron strings and allow your young ones to fly the nest. Sophie gave her mother a hug goodbye and reassured her that she would be back home soon. She planned to return in 2 months' time with new stories and tales from her new life, but tragically, very little did either of them know that this was going to be the last hug they would ever share together. Sophie returned to her packing, and only a few moments later she heard a knock at the bedroom door. Standing at the top of the stairs was her mom, and stood next to her was Clayton. With a large and uncharacteristic grin on his face, he said he wanted to see her before she left and give her something as a parting gift, just like she had done for him. Leslie looked up at her daughter, who, exasperated, rolled her eyes and motioned to let him in. Although she allowed him to enter, Sophie told Clayton that she was in a rush and that he would have to speak to her while she packed. She then closed the door to her bedroom as he sat down on her bed. Clayton was silent and unmoving, very different from the grinning man at the door, and this unsettled Sophie quite a lot. So she went downstairs to ask for help. Sophie and her mother decided it was best to ask him to leave. His violence toward her just 1 month prior was still very fresh in both of their minds, and so she returned upstairs to tell him to go away. But just after her daughter reached the top of the stairs, Leslie heard a sound that she would never forget. It was the bone-chilling scream of her daughter. Leslie ran up the stairs as fast as she could and pounded against the door, but it wouldn't open. She threw her body against it instead, but still the door wouldn't budge. It appeared to be locked from the inside. Leslie ran back downstairs as the screams of terror continued from her daughter, begging for Clayton to stop. After equipping herself with a screwer to open the door, she dialed 911. She eventually got through the emergency services, although she doesn't actually remember it, a likely response to severe trauma of the situation. She was in a state of panic, overwhelmed her with whatever horror was unfolding upstairs. By the time Leslie had managed to break open the door with the skewer, the screaming had stopped. As soon as she opened the door, she knew that her daughter was lost. She saw her motionless body lying on the floor, wounded horrifically, and Clayton was above her, still rhythmically using the knife. Deep down, Leslie knew that her daughter was beyond help. After she heard the operator tell her to run, she closed the door and evacuated the house as fast as she could. Moments later, once in a place of safety, the distraught woman collapsed at the end of her driveway, her heart breaking, evident in agony. Moments later, a lone officer arrived at the scene, entirely underprepared for what he was about to see, defensively making his way upstairs. He opened the door to find the monstrous Clayton standing over Sophie's body. His hands were by his sides, a blank expression fixed firmly on his face. Asking him why he did it, Clayton replied, "Because of all the emotional pain she has caused me over the past year." He made no attempts to resist arrest. Sophie's family were utterly devastated. In the space of a few short minutes, a brutal and twisted intruder had turned their loving home into a nightmarish crime scene, one that would forever haunt them. Autopsy reports concluded that Sophie had been stabbed a total of 219 times stabs across the face, chest, and abdomen with a knife and a pair of scissors. Now, I want you to really think about the number for a moment and imagine the sheer level of energy, hatred, and time required to do such a thing. As for Clayton, the man was formally arrested and charged with murder. Despite admitting that he had killed her at the time, he later insisted that he wasn't guilty. Court proceedings for this case were emotional, messy, and took much longer than anyone had hoped for. But in June 2009, after a year and a half, Clayton finally went on trial. Mountains of evidence collected from the crime scene, such as photos, fingerprints, DNA, and witness reports, made Clayton's defense something that he couldn't possibly perfect, no matter how hard he tried. The judge even admitted it that his case held some of the most harrowing details that he had ever experienced. But Clayton's defense was adamant in proving that he was not guilty. As expected, they portrayed him as a complicated yet troubled individual with multiple layers of self-esteem issues and a crippling personality disorder. And although this is usually heavily advised against, Clayton even took the stand in an effort to express his own insecurities to the court. I have no idea what he was trying to achieve through some of this commentary, because some of it was very strange. There is a part that is public where he said, "I asked her about the size of this man's penis. I think it was after an ego boost for me and insecurity. And the judge asked, 'Did you get the boost you were after?' And then he said, 'No, not at all.' And as previously mentioned, it was a long and messy trial. Many character witnesses from both sides took the stand to testify against both Clayton and Sophie. Friends of Sophie were forced under oath to discuss her sexual relations, while she and Clayton were intermittently dating. There is a defense that asked a friend of Sophie, "Sophie got very drunk one night and ended up in bed with a person. Is that right?" She answered yes. "And Sophie met up with a Dutch person. I think she'd be described as Danish. And you're aware that that encounter was also involved sexual intercourse?" She answered yes. "And you were aware that that developed into a sexual relationship?" Where she answered yes. "And that person was married?" She answered yes again. The defense argued that Sophie was just as evil as Clayton and would often joke with friends about his lack of sexual prowess. They even tried to convince the jury that Sophie had a personal obsession over him and tried to paint her as a malicious stalker who wouldn't leave him alone. But friends and family strongly disagreed with these arguments, saying that, on the contrary, it was actually Clayton who held an obsessive personality and often tried to control her whereabouts. Several witnesses also confirmed that Clayton often pointed out her supposed flaws, which in his mind were usually physical aspects of her body. But regardless of her beauty, features, or even her sexual status, there was absolutely no excuse for the actions he had committed, especially at the level of utter brutality that they were performed under. He apparently had cut off her ears, stabbed in her eyes, and also cut off a nipple of her breast. Throughout this trial, the severity and heinous of Clayton's actions became all too clear. It was obvious that their relationship was unhealthy and entirely devoid of respect. Even if Sophie had provoked hurtful emotions in Clayton, there was nothing that justified his twisted response. During this defense, Clayton argued that Sophie has lunged at him with a pair of scissors, and when he pulled out his knife, he was merely acting in self-defense. But this argument doesn't explain why he carried the knife from his own kitchen to her house in the first place. With the difference in height, weight, and age, Sophie had no hope or chance to overpower Clayton in a fight. It therefore made no sense for her to attack him. But it was the sheer brutality of the murder that secured the judge's final decision. No person should have the right to walk free after aggressively stabbing someone 219 times. And so, after 4 weeks of trial, Clayton was formally found guilty of murdering Sophie Elliot and was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for 18 years. Clayton was a terribly narcissistic man with multiple personal and behavioral issues that were never addressed or corrected. These issues manifested in the worst possible way by being inflicted on others, ultimately leading to the loss of a bright and beautiful life that could have gone on to become something incredible. Sophie was doing the right thing by trying to create distance between herself and a monster who insulted and defaulted her on a daily basis. Friends described Sophie as kind, thoughtful, and very ambitious, putting maximum energy into everything that she did. Sadly, this empathic nature was abused by an awful person who was given one too many chances. At what was supposed to be Sophie's graduation ceremony, her brother Chris stepped up and accepted her degree in her honor. It was a notable but painful action that no one should ever have to do. Leslie's experience was particularly raw. Not only had she witnessed the death of her daughter, but throughout this trial, she had to recount that horrific day on multiple occasions. Eventually, her own struggles and turmoil spurred her to write a book about grief. She also spearheaded the creation of the Sophie Elliot Foundation, a charity created to aid women who have become victims of domestic abuse. Sophie had spent her entire life building herself a better future, only for it to be ripped away by an evil, narcissistic, insecure man who allegedly had a small penis. Fortunately, Clayton Witherspoon is now behind bars, and hopefully this will be for many decades to come. Personally, I hope that we never see the day that this parole is granted, as the world is a safer place with him off the streets. I think that just about concludes our story today. Thank you so much for watching another video by ASMR True Crime channel. If you liked this video, please hit the like button and subscribe if you haven't done so. It would help me a lot.